Hello, hello. I see people are jumping in and joining us. Welcome, welcome. If you will, say hello and where you're coming from in the chat. We kind of love to get a perspective on our community today, where everyone's from, as Miss Kimberly gives us some great support on how to have effective communication and keep that balance. Hi, Erica from Iowa. Way to kick us off.
Nice.
I'm from Illinois. I think Kimberly also is joining from the same state. So we've got WT, proud papa from Palmyra. Hi, WT. We got Misty, welcome from Des Moines. And hello, Denton, Texas, Sacramento, California, Morris, Illinois. Hello, Belinda, Jeanette, and Jenny. Hi, Pamela. Welcome, welcome. Hello, Melanie, another Chicagoan.
Love it.
Yes, we've got some instructions in the chat as well. So be sure and stay tuned to the chat and hear what's going on. Make sure you do select everyone so we can all see and hear what is happening as you bring your voice and your questions and comments into the room. Kimberly expressed a desire to hear from everyone. So if you hear or think of something along the way and you want to contribute, please drop that in the chat, or Andrew can get you unmuted and we'd love to hear your voice as well. Aloha, Gwen. Good to have you all the way from Hawaii. I have no idea what time it is there. I did a training once and it was like they were up at 3 a.m. It was awesome.
That is awesome.
Yes. Awesome. Awesome. All right. We are going to get started. So Andrew, if you will kick us on to the next one. There are a couple ways to engage, and I kind of just reviewed for a quick second, but here they are formally. So when you're ready to speak, you can raise your hand. There is a raise hand button featured at the bottom of your screen or on the more if you're using a mobile, and we can ask you to unmute, bring your voice into the space, say your comment, ask your question. Feel free to type your comments as well. I can bring those in the space as we continue through today's webinar. And do be patient. We obviously love to have lots of people bring in their energy and their experience as well. And then Kimberly has some content she's going to bring to us today. Go ahead, Andrew. As with all Be Strong family events, we love to create a brave and a safe space. And so within this space, there's a few agreements that we all want to lean into. And so what's going to happen is we're going to speak from our own experience. We're going to use those I statements. So I, Karina, ... rather than, speaking about my sister, my brother, right? Following the golden rule, treat other people the way you want to be treated. That goes along the lines, if you want to put your pronouns after your name, if you want to type the correct name that you would prefer to be referenced by, et cetera, et cetera. Being respectful, listening, communicating. Full presence, please no multitasking. Obviously, we want everybody to be here. It's a webinar style, a little bit different, but we do want your presence here and your attention. And if you need a minute, take a minute. If you can type agree, I agree in the chat, I will join you on this as well, so we can get everyone. Thank you, Miss Kimberly, as well. One, two, three. All right. Gwen, understandable. Early in the morning for you. You have a pass. All right, go ahead, Andrew. Thank you. I'm getting those agreements in the chat. All right, so I am today's host. I am Karina Hohenschel with Be Strong Families, and I am super honored and super excited to introduce to you today Miss Kimberly Cook. And this topic, as you all well know, that it is finding communication balance in difficult conversations. No one wants to have them. No one wants to lean into them. So I am excited, Kimberly, to get some tips and tricks and just maybe a mind space that we can show up in so that this balance can be found. So I'm going to hand it off to you, and Andrew's going to work your PowerPoint. If you've got questions, I'm here in the chat and here supporting you.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Karina. I really appreciate that. And Andrew, for your support, and just thrilled to be here with Bistro, family community. So thank you so much, everybody, for having me today. As Karina mentioned, I am Kimberly Cook. I am a divorce and family attorney located in Chicago. My practice is exclusively now divorce mediation and family mediation. And so a huge part of mediation is all about conflict resolution. But truly, how do we resolve conflict? It starts with communication. So with that, Andrew, if you can, great. So, today's topic is finding communication balance in difficult conversations. Next slide, please. Communication. We hear that phrase a lot. We often think about, ways of communicating and how we communicate, and we communicate in more than one way, right? So we know that there's, our verbal communication, but there's also what our body language is a way that we often communicate. And then when you think about things like, active listening, key word there is active. That too is a way of communication. So as we talk today about how we find balance, we're really going to kind of center in on this idea of communication and what it means to really find balance in all of the aspects of communication. We can move forward with the next slide, which should be a quote. I love a good quote, right? Because it really kind of frames in many ways a lot of the things that I often want to talk to or remind ourselves. So as we move forward, we want to think about the framework as we talked about communication, and a good relationship starts with good communication. And anybody who says otherwise, unfortunately, doesn't know what it means to be in a good relationship. Right? So it's all about communication. That's what we're going to talk about in finding our balance in communication. Okay, let's move forward, please. So, really thinking about, different types of communication, we want to start by saying, what I call people-oriented. So ways that we often show up in our communication styles. So there's passive, passive-aggressive, aggressive, and assertive. So let's kind of work through those a little bit. And as I'm, working through those, think about the circumstances by which you might find yourself in these different kind of types of communication spaces. So passive, right? What does it mean to communicate in a passive way? Well, it often means that, I'm being emotionally dishonest. And think about, the times that you find yourself being passive. If it often shows up when there's a real imbalance, when you really kind of feel, out of sorts. So you are emotionally being dishonest because you're not in the space of being assertive. You're not in the space of being direct. You're in the self-denying, maybe in the apologetic or blaming. That's how we are communicating when we are passively communicating. Passive aggressive is a little bit different, right? You're still in that kind of emotionally dishonest. There's still some sense of imbalance, but now it's a, indirect aggression. There's something that's sneaking out from under. It's self-denying at first, but self-enhancing later. I've been known to say, I cannot, of all the levels of communication and communication styles, passive aggressive communication to me is, for me, the worst, right? I don't receive passive aggressive communication very well. And a part of that is because it's either just be passive or be aggressive. Cut it to me straight, right? I'm not interested in the, wait, was that supposed to be, aggressive, or were they being nice? Nope, let's just cut it, call it what it is. So passive aggressive, how do you, kind of show up in some of these communication styles? Aggressive, we know what aggressive is, right? But sometimes, we're not actually clear on how aggressive we really are being, or how it's being received, because there is a fine line sometimes between aggressive and assertive, and we'll get to assertive here in a moment. But aggressive really starts from a place of being inappropriately honest, right? So, it's fine to be directive in communication. It's important to say what needs to be said, but where things kind of change is where there is an inappropriate nature to the directness or the honesty, where it's overly expressive, where the communication style is really more about control and self-enhancing. So really kind of pushing the levels of balance in your corner and to your side in a way that then puts the other person squarely in that passive space. That's going to feel, and often is, different than assertive, right? One can be assertive in their communication, but what that looks like is being appropriately honest, being direct. It is self-enhancing, meaning that the expression and the information that is being provided, we're not mincing words, we're very clear intentionally about how we're communicating, and that is received by the other party or the listener in many ways as they are communicating me in a way that is directive, that they're confident in the information that they're providing, but they are not trying to force me into an uncomfortable space or into a passive space. So when we think about types of communication, and as we start talking about balance, I want you to give some thought to these 4 areas and scenarios and circumstances by which you have found yourself passive, passive-aggressive, aggressive, or even being assertive. Let's move forward and talk about the next phase of communication in our next slide, please. Task-oriented, right? So we talked about the people-oriented. So let's now, when we think about communication, let's now talk about the task-oriented types of communication. And under task-oriented, we know there's dominant, there's influencer, and if you're of a certain age, that's all the rage. Everybody wants to be an influencer, but we'll talk about what that really means and what that is. And then there's a I can't even say it today, conscientiousness, sorry, everybody. And then there's steady. So dominant, decisive, efficient, intense, and you're going to be result oriented when you're communicating in that way, right? You often hear people who, say, I'm of a dominant nature and I communicate in a way that is decisive, efficient. But when you're dominant, sometimes that a dominant plus aggressive becomes where you really have shifted when we think about communication balance, and the dynamic is squarely in the aggressive column. Dominant can also be materialized or received when you are assertive, right? So when you're assertive and you think about the information that I'm providing or how I'm providing information or the space that I am taking up, we're looking at the spaces of being intense, results-oriented, competitive. Influencer now, certainly with the rise of social media, is all the rage. And what does that really mean? Well, certainly it's, outgoing, it's enthusiastic, but the key here is really about persuasion, right? So it's about influencing someone else and having a communication style that is persuasive based on the goal that we're trying to reach, right? So, if the goal is to influence someone to purchase something, right, then we're outgoing and enthusiastic about that specific thing. If the influence is I'm trying to influence my co-parent, and again, here comes my, background in being a divorce and family attorney, knowing many times that people try to influence their co-parent into things that they want them to do, we then start seeing things show up in terms of that, whether it's that passive aggressive kind of space Sometimes it's the aggressive space, but the task at hand and the way it's being communicated is truly by this idea of influence. Okay. Then we move to, again, for some reason today, my mouth is just not working. The consciousness, the systematic, logistical, cautious, and risk adverse. This is that space that most people find themselves in, especially when you're thinking about conflict and finding them in spaces of imbalance, right? So I'm risk adverse. I don't want to, upset the apple cart, as many say. I need to think through the task at hand. I need to think through how I want to respond. And when I don't have the ability to really do that, then my communication style almost, in most cases, ends up being passive. And in some spaces, then passive aggressive, less on the assertive side. And finally, task-oriented communication, types of communication, steady. Steady really shows up and is manifested when we think about these, having the idea of confidence, right? So you're comfortable being in the space of cooperation. You're relaxed because you feel good about how you're communicating. You're feeling open to what is being provided or the information that you're receiving. You're patient. You're support-oriented, friendly, and thorough. Steady plus, say, assertive is really where we truly find the idea of balance, right? So as we're walking through and thinking about circumstances by which you engage with others, where we really want to try to find ourselves is in the assertive, steady space, because now it's a really nice combination of cooperation, friendly, thorough, relaxed because you're confident, but you feel very good about asserting your interest and your needs. So let's move forward. So common signs of communication, imbalance. So we have our persistent insecurity, lack of communication, unfulfilled interactions, and then one-sided. So as we look at this slide and you think about the circumstances that you have been in or situations that you see as an outsider, they often present themselves in these four corners. So persistent insecurity, that is as it says, meaning that the imbalance is you have one person who is not able to be assertive. They are not in a position to be comfortable or confident. And they certainly are not in a space of having the ability to even move forward to aggression. They are consistently and persistently insecure, and therefore their communication style is often squarely in the passive space. I'll give you an example. We find, persistent insecurity in a lot of domestic violence and domestic abuse cases because the relationship is so imbalanced that the passive person has now lost their ability to rebalance it in any way. And so there is this persistent insecurity of engaging in some level of communication. Let's talk about lack of communication. So oftentimes, we think about, the idea of communicating, and many times people think to themselves, I don't want to engage at all if it is going to, create a fight, right? Or I don't want to, I'm conflict adverse. And so what am I going to do? I'm not going to engage at all. It's, it's what I call kind of the ostrich syndrome, right? So I'm going to put my head in the sand and I'm just going to let things go on around me because I just don't want to engage. Here's the problem. The lack of communication creates its own imbalance that is really hard to rebalance. The reason for that is because the person that you're communicating with really has no way of recognizing or understanding what needs to be done because you have stopped all level of communication. Now, make no mistake, are there times when, it's important to kind of stop the conversation or the communication? Yes. But even communicating that is some level of communication and rebalance. And we'll talk a little bit later about the importance of setting boundaries and sticking to those boundaries. But one of the ways of making sure that you set boundaries is by letting others know about those boundaries. So there has to be some level of communication for you to establish a balanced communication. That's very similar to this area of unfulfilled interactions. So often the person who feels like I'm being ignored, or, I'm not kind of receptive to how they're communicating, they feel very unfulfilled, right? And so the interaction with the other person often creates an imbalance simply because it's an unfulfilled interaction. With setting boundaries or setting expectations, we know and we fulfilled whatever the interactions just by setting those things in place. But think about, how many times you go, I'm trying to think if they even now, because of COVID, if people do kind of the buffet lines, right? So let's think about a buffet. And think about how you first get into, the buffet line, and there's all of this food, and you're almost overwhelmed with the amount of food. You get your plate, you go, you put, some things on your plate. You then go and you sit down and you eat a plateful. And then you look over and you're like, oh man, now they've put out all of the seafood, and here's the crab, and here's the lobster, but I'm stuffed, right? And it's okay. I had in my head this expectation that all of this food was going to be available, and I'm going to just, be able to enjoy any and everything. But here's the reality. The reality is your stomach isn't on that plan. Right. And so there is an unfulfilled, because now you're disappointed. Now you've paid, the $49.95 or whatever it is for the all you can eat buffet, knowing that really there's only one round. And so there is a sense of disappointment. It's unfulfilled despite the fact that this amazing buffet was before you. I will say, just, and throughout, I'm an sharer. So let's say that, and this is kind of, a family discussion. And I think it's important to always have kind of a family connection. So I will say that the master of the buffet and buffet styles has always been my dad, right? Because he is like, we're here, let's just hang out all day. So in that way, there is a level of being fulfilled, because we're not just going to load up one plate, take this, take your time, give it some time and work through it. But when we think about this idea of connection and communication, you want that same type of fulfillment. So the interactions might need to take time. You might need to assess what the relationship is and how we're communicating with one another, so that you don't have unfulfilled interactions. Okay. And then one-sided. That is very, I think, clear that you want to make sure that the communication isn't one-sided, right? So example of kind of what one-sided looks like, it's the parent-child, right? Parent says, this is what you're doing, this is how you're doing it, don't talk back, don't ask questions, it's my way or the highway, period, point blank. That's one-sided communication, okay? One-sided often, again, leans more to the aggressive space. That's where it shows up, where someone is moving beyond the assertive. They've now moved into the aggressive in saying, it's what I say in the way that I say it, and you are going to receive it in that way. That's the common sign then of a one-sided communication. Next slide, please. So, I'd love to hear from those of you, who are joining us today, what do you think when you think about just this idea of communication and communication and balance, and those times where you have found yourself either as, passive, aggressive, assertive, or even aggressive. And I want you to think about times, where how could you tell that there was a communication imbalance? What were the signs for you? And what does it, kind of feel like, right? So physically, emotionally, so that we can talk about, ways that communication imbalance in our everyday lives, really kind of present themselves. So I think, yes, everybody is muted. So I think you have to kind of put it in the chat. Am I right?
Yep, absolutely. Drop it in the chat. Give your perspective, give your feedback on the last couple of slides. I'm gonna interject a little something while I'm waiting for people to bring theirs forth. And one of the things I think that has just hit me really hard in these last 3 slides is your perspective and putting things in a framework that you can reference, so you can consistently reference, because sometimes emotion has a play in things and you're like, well, I'm not that way, but then you step back. Yeah. Or you peel that emotion back, you're like, wow, in that moment, in that season, I was. And then hearing the concept of balance and how those 4 frameworks kind of give you a reference point on why it's unbalanced. So for me, that was powerful. And I'm seeing people and I'm seeing relationships and I'm seeing conversations pop up in reference to those, and recognize I'm ready to, how can I show up differently, or how can I go back so I don't do that again. Right. So I know personally. So
no, that's great. And, certainly thank you, for sharing. I think, as we start thinking about our own different relationships, right? And where the balance or imbalance really kind of comes from. So, I'll think about, just for myself, I am a wife, I'm a mother, I'm someone's daughter, right? So let's just start there, right? And so when I think about, okay, in my communication and interactions with my parents, right? How do I show up that may be different than my communication with my children? How are those things being received? And how do I create that balance so that, as again, a full-on grown adult, right, I don't default to, say, the passive space when I'm engaging with my parents, but I'm also, though, making sure that it's balanced with respect, even if it is assertive and direct. That's also really important when I think about, engaging with my children, right? That we find that balance so that I am not always in the space of being assertive, or I'm sure if they were here, they would say aggressive, depending on what the issue is, particularly now that we've started school back and we're all trying to get into routine. But, so that I am mindful too, that when I'm communicating with them, that it should be a balanced communication, because you want your children to learn the skills so that as they go out into the world, they can recognize, okay, there is an imbalance here, and it's really, really important how I can make sure that I balance it. And we'll talk about some tips to balancing.
I love that. Absolutely. There is a comment in the chat, as I think when I feel minimized and like I want to run away or shrink away from the interaction. So I think it also depends on the level of significance the person with whom you're communicating has for you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And thank you for sharing that. I think we all kind of defer to the, okay, who is this person in my life? And, what will kind of the impact be, but depending on how I communicate with them.
Mhm.
Let's jump to the next slide as others are, thinking through things, because it's really important for us to understand that in all relationships and in all spaces that you should have and find the balance, because that's really what's going to make the relationship even stronger. Okay. So when we think about, imbalanced development, we've got different communication styles, different relationship expectations, the status, right? So where's that imbalance come from? And relationship history. This is all framing the imbalance. So again, when we think about, boss, employee, parent, child, co-workers, your doctor and patient, you're bringing all of those things to the relationship and to, the interaction and communication. And so you have to think about, is there already an inherent imbalance when I'm already showing up? And the answer to that in all cases is yes, unless that has already been a pre-established relationship where the communication balance has been met. So different communication styles, we all communicate in different ways, right? So I am, a full body communicator, right? So I talk with my hands, I'm very expressive. I also am a very, verbal. It's very important to me that when I want to communicate something, that it's not in writing, it's, me getting it out. Okay. I'm married to someone who is probably the exact opposite of that communication style, a lot more reserved, not very expressive in many ways in terms of body language. And so what happens many times is I have to remember when we are engaging and talking about, different things and expectations in our house, right? Our different communication styles, right? So, and that could even be an exciting conversation, right? I get very excited and you see it all over my face. I am not one to play poker. I'm telling you right now, this is not your girl for that. But you have to know the communication style, or at least get a sense, because that's going to help us when we think about balanced development. Relationship expectations. What is the relationship that you currently have with this individual? Is it ongoing? Is it temporary and short term? That too helps us identify where the imbalance may be and how we shift it. Status. We certainly want to understand, and this really has a lot to do when we think about like your employer, employee, that's a really strong one. Oftentimes, does this person have the power to fire me if I, say something wrong? Am I in a position to fire them? So thinking about where the status imbalance may be. And then, as we were referencing really in the chat as well, what's our relationship history, right? What is the significance of our relationship history? I see, we think oftentimes about our own personal relationships and how we are not being either, seen or heard. And many times it really stems from our different communication styles and our relationship expectations, especially when we talk about our family relationships, right? Because those come with all kinds of other things with it. And so you add to that expectations and communication styles. And I tell you, it's ripe for imbalance and, and in some cases, dysfunction, because we have to figure out how to balance it so that we have healthy, happy relationships, which, as we started out by saying, come from good communication. Next slide, please. So yay, now it's about finding balance, right? So we've talked about, identifying imbalance. We've talked about these spaces where you feel imbalanced or understanding the different communication styles, but how do we actually create that balance? So let's see what the next slide is. Oh, I told you I'm all about quotes, right? So here's the key. Balance is not something you find, it's something you create. Let's sit with that just for a second, because I think that's such a huge statement that I think if you think it through, right? Balance is not something you find, it's something you create. Let's talk about how we create them. Let's create balance. Next slide, please. So, creating balance. Three ways: safety and boundaries, exploring varying options, and moving forward. It's as simple and not simple as that, right? So safety and boundaries, exploring options, and moving forward. Next slide, please. Safety first, always. I can't stress that enough, because in every situation, if you are in an unsafe situation, you will not create balance. Okay, it's not possible. And so we always start from a place of safety. You never engage in a difficult conversation where your safety is compromised. That's first and foremost. That's a dead stop. Okay. I think it's important that we, be very clear that when your safety is compromised, you get the appropriate professional help, whether that's a lawyer, a mediator, therapist, a police officer, any kind of other trained intermediary. If you're in an employment setting, everybody has an HR department. There is always, always, always some way to get the necessary help and assistance that you may need. But first and foremost, we want to be very clear that you cannot create balance if you're unsafe. So safety is always first. Once we've kind of determined, all right, I'm good, I'm safe, or safety in and of itself is not a concern or an issue, then we talk about establishing and maintaining boundaries. And here's the thing, that's harder than it seems, right? Creating boundaries is really, really difficult, especially depending on the relationship that you have or are trying to establish with the person that you are engaging with or communicating with. Communication requires everybody to have boundaries. But here's the thing about boundaries. You have to maintain them. So it's really a two-step process, right? So establishing your boundaries and maintaining your boundaries, that's how now we're getting balanced communication. Why? Because there's no point in establishing the boundary of saying, okay, I'm only going to give this conversation 30 minutes, or I'm only going to engage, so long as neither one of us are using, abusive or disrespectful language or tone. And then the minute you start engaging, all that flies out the window. Well, that's not going to help you. So you need to establish and maintain your boundaries. But as you're doing that, think about the relationship or the person that you're communicating with. So for example, you're engaging with your children, and you know that maybe the morning time, getting them ready for school, maybe that's just like super hectic and crazy and not the ideal time to have a conversation about homework expectations, or having a conversation about, setting up disciplinary, parameters. But you can't say that in your head and then go downstairs in the morning with breakfast and then start engaging and talking and yelling about, why homework should be done. Establish, maintain the boundaries, because that's going to set the expectation and reset the balance for everybody. It also is going to help you to decide how you want to engage. So, for example, as a divorce attorney, I go in knowing everybody is in a very emotional space. Okay. I'm empathetic to that. I've been doing this a long time, but here's my rule, and I make it very clear. What we're not going to do is use offensive language. You can be distraught, you can be angry, you can be upset, but we're not using offensive language. That's a boundary that I set and I maintain. How do I maintain it? The moment that I have a client who is using offensive language, I shut it completely down, which is saying to them, as a reminder, that is not how we engage. So we will circle back when you have gotten yourself, together. Because I have found that so long as you set your boundaries and you make it very clear as to what your boundaries are, if you maintain them, people will respect them. If though so if we're in that same example, if I start to engage in offensive language, if I let one or two offensive things slide, all bets are off, right? You're not getting that back, because it's no longer, you've moved the goalposts, you've changed the boundaries, you've changed the lane. So you have to decide, these are the things that I'm establishing, and I'm going to maintain them, because that's going to keep the balance in this communication to where I need it to be. That takes, though, preparation, right? So I get it. We don't all have time to kind of sit down and think through, when I'm engaging with my kids or when I'm engaging with my boss, right? No, preparation really comes down to two things. One, yes, it is important to prepare for more of the really difficult conversations that you may have, right? So, you might find yourself in a situation where you and your spouse are at a space where you're considering separating, or you're considering, a change in the relationship. That's a conversation that is difficult to have and that you should prepare for. That's going to be a little bit different than kind of your day-to-day interactions, maybe with your in-laws, right? How do you mentally, let me just tell you, that's taken some preparation. So in those times when you're not engaging with them, think about, how do I feel when I'm engaging with this person? And what do I need to do to prepare for future engagement with them? That's what we're talking about, preparation. Okay. And again, I will say these things take work. This is not a one and done, especially if we're talking about kind of those longer established relationships, and understanding that creating balance, it takes time, and things, ebb and flow. Think about, again, I'm a visual, think about a seesaw, right? So, in order for everybody to be balanced, one, you need two people, right? But everybody has to, for it to stay where one person isn't up and the other one isn't slammed on the ground, right? You have to really kind of both engage in a way that keeps you in that middle space. I said seesaw, and clearly I'm dating myself. I don't think they even do seesaws maybe at playgrounds anymore, because, there was that, like, you drop one kid and, gosh. So I'll have to think of, as I'm going forward, I'll have to think of another playground example, because maybe we don't do seesaws anymore. But preparation is really all about taking the time to think about how I engage, how I want to engage, whether it's I default to that passive space, or I become very aggressive, what the relationship is or has been, as you think through the other thing. Oh, I stand corrected. Andrew, thank you. You said you saw a seesaw the other day. Great. I'm telling you, I'm not sure that kids have those anymore, but sounds like they might. And then, finally, when we think about safety and boundaries, ground yourself. Okay. Breathing techniques, anxiety tools, writing things down. And I'm going to touch on the use silence as a strategy in a second, because that one is a powerful one if it's done correctly. But things like taking a moment, taking a breath, those things are important. If you know that I'm going to engage with somebody who really just triggers me, who really just gets me, then find something to help you calm your nerves, to calm yourself. Maybe that's bringing kind of the stress ball with you. Maybe that's saying, okay, I feel better engaging if we are in a public space. Maybe we're taking a walk. I'm not on their turf, meaning maybe I'm not in their office if it's your boss. But in some ways you can't do anything about kind of where the interaction occurs. And so, for example, in the boss scenario, maybe that means I know I feel the imbalance already because of the position. I know I'm now on their turf. Bring something with you. Bring your notepad with you. Bring your stress ball with you. Take a moment to ground yourself before the conversation even starts. But let's talk about using silence as a strategy. That's very different from disengage or not engaging or ignoring. Using silence as a strategy is really about taking that moment and holding it. So if the conversation is going, the interaction is going, and you feel like, oh boy, I'm losing steam, just sit quietly. Just give yourself a moment. Here's what often happens. The other person is like, are you not hearing me? Do you not, wait, what's going on? And you can calmly just say, I just need a moment. What do you think? And if the response is no, now we go back to, what were my boundaries? And maybe this is my indication that we're not going to get balanced in this conversation. And therefore, I'm going to remove myself from the conversation. But sometimes, and in most cases, it's let me take a moment, let me breathe in, let me not immediately respond, let me hold it, and then proceed. I will tell you, silence works very well with children. When you are engaging with children and there's a whole host of, back and forth, and, you are ready to kind of pounce, and maybe you're thinking, oh, this is going to I'm being a little aggressive, say nothing. It makes them uncomfortable. They're not sure what's happening. And then you're able to bring the temperature down and then continue in the conversation. Silence as a strategy works if you do it well and consistent. So you have to be consistent with it. And how long the silence is really depends on, how long you really need. But I would say breathe in, take about, 3 good kind of, calming breaths. That's a good kind of, all right, I'm assessing the situation, and now we can proceed because now I've reestablished my space and my boundaries. Okay, next slide, please. Exploring our options. We talked about, sometimes things take a turn or you need additional assistance. Exploring our options, dispute resolution, litigation, professional reporting, and our not avoidance. Okay, when we think about communication and imbalance and thinking about all the ways they show up, first and foremost, dispute resolution, right? So that doesn't have to be in a legal context. It can be in any context. So you and your neighbor are not getting along because, you know, how the grass is looking, or maybe the answer is to have someone else in the neighborhood kind of come in and diffuse the situation. Maybe it's, you know, something is going on with the school that you've got some concerns about, and you've tried to talk to the teacher and not getting the kind of response, or you feel intimidated because it's the principal engaging. Now, you know, maybe we look to what's the school board, you know, maybe they can kind of give voice to your concern, or another parent who is maybe better at kind of asserting some concerns, right? So finding ways, exploring options to bring that balance back through methods like dispute resolution. Litigation. Okay, I'm a litigator through and through. That's what I do. It's you know, been my career, but I will tell you, litigation is often the nuclear option unless, you know, you're prepared for that, right? Going to court, that's what litigation means. And so in very rare cases, that's the answer to create balance, because litigation doesn't create balance. Litigation is designed to be adversarial. It is designed to have a win or lose. So win or lose doesn't create balance. In fact, it's a one-sided kind of decision. So if in fact that is where things need to go when we think about recreating balance styles in communication, because the interactions have completely failed, then we're looking at litigation. Professional reporting, you know, it often seems like, that's kind of weird when you think about communication. That goes specifically to who you're engaging with, who you're communicating with. So we talked a little bit about things like engaging with an employer, or engaging with somebody else who have you know, certain areas where professional reporting may be helpful. And then last but not least, again, we talk about, we don't avoid things, right? We make sure that we try using the tips that we've talked about to recreate the balance, or finding balance in communication and in these relationships, but we don't avoid it at all. I want to be mindful of the time. And so in the event, you know, please, you have questions or you know, comments, please put them in the chat, because I want to make sure that we answer them as we kind of, you know, finish up and close up here, because I really want to make sure that people are being heard, despite that this is in many ways one-sided, because I'm doing all the communicating. Next slide, please. Moving forward, right? Tell yourself that I'm going to do what I can, when I can, how it works for me, with my head held high, right? That's how we move forward. That's how we create balance. That's the way for us as we engage, as we communicate, as we think about, am I in the passive space? How do I balance that out? Am I being in the aggressive space? How do I balance that out? What tools do I need to have with me so that I can be direct and assertive, emotionally honest with myself, but to receive the information in a way that works for everybody, as well as disseminate the information that works for everybody. So you want to do what you can, when you can, how it works for you. That's our boundary space, with your head held high, because that's our, you know, confidence. That's our confidence space. Next slide, please. And if there's nothing that you took from this, take the quote from Beyonce that says, I don't have to prove anything to anyone. I only have to follow my heart and concentrate on what I have to say to the world. I run my world. Nothing better than a Beyonce quote to end out a balancing of communication. But I think it's important to take from that, you know, you create your space, you create the balance, because as we know, balance was not born, it is created. And so it's really, really, really important that you find that for yourself, because you do, in fact, run your world. So with that, I am Kimberly Cook, and I am again so appreciative of everybody joining us today. And, you know, hopefully you have learned some things today that will help you as you move forward in thinking about how you show up in conversations, how you engage with others, and, so that you two can have balanced relationships and communication.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I want to hear applause, but I'm not going to as the webinar and everyone's muted. So everyone just drop your gratitude in the chat. Let her know something that you are taking away. One of the ways that you can do that is this amplify hashtag. So as we heard a variety of things that Kimberly brought to the table today, what was it that jumped out at you? One of the things she started us off with was amplify communication balance. So I am looking forward to hearing, I'm buying into that concept now even more, and I'm looking forward to digging deeper as well. So I've got some people in the chat, amplify different communication styles. Others are saying thank you, very helpful, and thank you. I absolutely enjoyed it as well. Yes, emojis of how I feel after this. I think that in my perspective, I'm like, give me more, right? 1 hour wasn't enough. So what does this look like going forward as we continue to put some of these frameworks into work? Maybe doing some retroactive repair, but being able to shift in those relationships, like I said, with our children. Those are great ones. Those ongoing relationships. I love that you mentioned in-laws. I'll be camping with them this weekend. Parents.
You needed this.
Yes, I laughed. I was like, she didn't. but recognizing, and I think it's that preparation of how to show up continually. And so recognizing, because something always was this way. For me, it's the freedom and empowerment. So like, I'm going to amplify empowerment. It doesn't have to stay that way. Like we can re-engage boundaries, and we can shift and be able to go forward and show up differently.
Absolutely. And it really, especially in those longer, relationships, it really is about figuring out, here's how we started, but how do we balance this relationship? How do we balance the communication style? And really this idea of preparation, taking stock of, how do I feel when I engage with this individual, or how do I perceive that they're feeling when they engage, with me? And so, how can we work on that as a going forward? It really, it's constant work that we're all trying to do. But, once kind of the signs to look for and to really take a step back, you're able to say, okay, how do I re-engage and balance these things?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Andrew has dropped in the chat for us the slides from the webinar today. So if there's something that you want to print out and put on your fridge, if you want to talk to people about, just to have a reminder, you've got those right there, as well as the YouTube recording. Andrew, are there any follow-up slides we need to wrap up with? We do have a Taste of Cafe. They are going back to Fridays. So if you have loved Mondays in August, they are reverting back to Fridays. So please don't hesitate to sign up for that. So this is serving hugs when needed, celebrating grandparents. So if you've got a grandparent still living and active, if you are a grandparent, invite them to join us. And that will be not this Friday, it's a holiday weekend, but the next Friday at noon. You can scan that QR code. Awesome, Andrew. Thank you. Anything else? We are recognizing that there are always a continuation of webinars in English and Spanish. So feel free to check out the calendar, check out the schedule, see which one works for you, topics that you need, scan that QR code and join us weekly. Mondays and Wednesdays are in English, and Tuesdays and Thursdays are in Spanish. So that way, if you want to share and join and learn something new, right? So we have the Be Strong Family Shop. There are always products, gifts, supplies, resources, games that you can use as communication tools. That's why we created Questionable, was to how can kids communicate with their parents on a level where they can feel heard and maybe learn something, flip the table, learn something about their parents. So that is why Questionable came to exist. So I think it's very apt, but recognize that there are always things like our cafe decks, those amplify calendars and such, that always empower you, give you a voice, and allow you to be heard in spaces and hear others. I like what you said, Kimberly, about that. Their perception of you in that space as well is powerful. Also, our YouTube community. So if you are not currently a subscriber and you don't want to miss out, please subscribe. I think we are right around 400 subscribers on that YouTube channel. And that has been a powerful couple-year experience as we've developed these webinars and continue to put out amazing content like today. Over 400, Andrew said. Woohoo! He's worked hard on that. So thank you so much, Kimberly, for joining us. Looking forward to more engagement with you, digging deeper in this balance through communication styles and myself and others. Thank you all who participated today. Looking forward to hearing your feedback and continuing to see how this ripple effect will take over in the world. This is our 1 hour, so we will see you next week. Thank you so much.